Presentation is titled Forest Carbon Project Feasibility in the Northeast, How to Achieve Multiple Co-Benefits. Our presenter today is Dr. Bill Keeton. Bill is Professor of Forest Ecology and Forestry at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. At UVM, he directs the Carbon Dynamics Laboratory and serves as a fellow in the Gunn Institute for Environment. Bill chairs the International Union of Forest Research Organizations Working Group on Old Growth Forests and Reserves. Finally, Bill serves on the Board of Trustees for Vermont Land Trust. Dr. Keeton received his BS in Natural Resources from Cornell University, his Master's in Conservation Biology and Policy from Yale University, and he holds a PhD in Forest Ecology from the University of Washington. And with that, we're glad you're joining us this morning, and welcome, Bill.
Well, thanks a lot, Kate, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'm really excited to share with you the work that my lab, the Carbon Dynamics Laboratory, has been doing for the last decade or so, and also work that I've been doing in collaboration with a number of other organizations, including Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, a consulting firm called Spatial Informatics Group, and a number of others. So we have a lot to cover, and I'll just get right into it. So my intent this morning is to bring everyone up to speed on the basics of forest carbon science, particularly those aspects of forest carbon science that one would need to understand if someone was interested in developing a forest carbon project. We want to take a quick look at the market context, meaning the carbon markets that have developed in recent years and that now are offering a financial incentive to do carbon forestry. And then a real specific emphasis of the talk this morning will be the idea that in managing forests for carbon, we might also be able to achieve other co-benefits. And in this talk, those are defined very specifically as conservation of working forests and open space, as well as flood resilience. So those will be themes that will come up repeatedly throughout this talk. To understand how all that works, we need to go over just a few basics of carbon silviculture. I have some research in that area to present to you. I also want to present some economic work we've done, really trying to isolate the factors that would influence financial viability of carbon projects in the Northeast. And really by the end of that section of this talk, I want to have convinced you that carbon projects are financially feasible. The period of caution and doubt is over. We know that these can work now, and I'm hoping that we'll all come out of this talk feeling like we can get busy doing it. And then sort of to drive that point home, I'll present our most recent results, hot off the press, out of something called the Vermont Forest Carbon Feasibility Study. So more on that later. Okay, so jumping up to basic forest carbon science, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page with this topic. I assume that everyone understands the idea that carbon is in constant flux in the Earth's system, constantly moving in and out of the atmosphere. And the point for carbon forestry is not that we want to prevent these fluxes or somehow inhibit or impede those fluxes, but rather that we want to control or direct those flux rates and pathways. So in other words, we want more carbon moving into terrestrial vegetation than is moving out, and over time we want to gradually build up the stocks of carbon or the storage of carbon in the terrestrial biosphere. So we understand that this is a dynamic system, carbon is in constant movement, but what we're hoping to achieve is a net increase in the amount of carbon that's stored in vegetation at any instant in time so that there's less CO2 in the atmosphere acting as a greenhouse gas. So we're managing this very much as a dynamic system. There's good news and bad news actually. If we take a look at the carbon sink capacity of forests globally, it's actually a fairly complicated picture. These are some data that were put together by Lud Pan and her colleagues a number of years ago, published in the very prestigious journal Science, in which they acknowledged that deforestation, particularly in the tropics, is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And estimates of the share of global annual emissions vary from about 15 to 20%, But deforestation is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, as you're seeing in this picture, there are many places of the world where at the same time that forests are being deforested or cleared, there's also regrowth to some extent of secondary forests. And in some parts of the world, the regrowth has been particularly dramatic. So for example, parts of the former Soviet Union, portions of the former East Bloc countries in Eastern Europe have had a major regrowth of forest in the last 20 or 30 years since the abandonment of collectivized agriculture under the communist and socialist regimes there. So when you put all of these numbers together, the world forests are actually still a net carbon sink, sequestering about 2.3 petagrams of carbon per year. That's actually a huge number. So this is actually encouraging for carbon forestry because it means that we can work with this trend. We can use carbon forestry to increase the sink capacity even further. And if we take a look at U.S. forests, again, we have a positive sink capacity to work with there. About 12% of annual greenhouse gas emissions are reabsorbed by U.S. forests, although here it's a more complicated picture because, of course, a big part of that actually is increased fuel loadings and densities in western coniferous forests as a result of fire suppression. So not necessarily a positive thing ecologically, and certainly a huge problem in terms of fire risks. But in any case, our forests are currently a net carbon sink. Okay, let's go over one other basic element of carbon science just to make sure that everybody understands terminology throughout the rest of the talk. There's a lot of confusion that enters into this topic between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So let's just make sure that we get that down. The dynamics of forest inputs and of carbon inputs and outputs change in a forest over time as that forest develops, and particularly as it develops elements of structural complexity associated with late successional forests. The period of greatest rates of carbon uptake, which means the same thing as sequestration, tends to occur in younger, rapidly growing forests. They're taking up a carbon at a very high rate, but they're not necessarily storing a lot of carbon in their biomass. So to achieve this effect of high rates of uptake, one typically has to clear or cut a forest that was there before, which of course means that you fluxed carbon out of the system at the same time that you're increasing the flux rates into the system. So that's very different from carbon storage, which tends to achieve its highest levels later in stand development and higher biomass, more structurally complex forests, at least in moist, mesic, temperate forests like we have here in the Northeast. Of course, you find variations around this in other parts of the world and other forest systems. But for us, this is how it works. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of these co-benefits just to set this up a little bit for you. And you'll see later in the talk that we've actually taken a hard look at co-benefits and actually tried to not only quantify them, but figure out where the opportunities on the landscape are to maximize co-benefits at the same time that we might be doing carbon projects. So let's talk about those co-benefits for a second. Why should we manage forests for carbon storage? Well, one really important one here, of course, is the idea of flood resilience, something that the region really woke up to after Hurricane Irene and the damage that ensued from that extremely high precipitation event. And so we know that there's a lot of work that we need to do on our landscape, both with our infrastructure, our development patterns, but also in terms of things like maintaining forest cover and how those forests are managed, things that we can do to enhance the resilience of our landscape to this kind of event. Now, this is actually something that I and some colleagues have looked at in a recent study. It just came out this year in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research. We wanted to know whether elements of river geomorphology, the structure of stream channels and stream systems, might vary as a function of the condition or the structure, meaning the architecture of the forests along those riverine corridors. So we went out and surveyed both the forest structure and the condition of the stream channels at 32 river reaches in the Vermont portion of the Lake Champlain Basin. And we found some very interesting things. We found a fairly significant relationship between the structure of the forests along these streams and rivers and the geomorphic condition of those river channels, measured here by something called the Rapid Geomorphic Assessment Score, which is really just a composite of a whole bunch of different indicators of stream condition that one can go out and survey. The interesting thing here is that there's a relationship not just between the basal area, or think of that as the structure, the biomass, the complexity of the forest, but also the variation in that structure over space. So spatial variability, patchiness, complexity both vertically and horizontally in these systems seems to influence the condition of the stream channel itself. So to a forest ecologist, you can look at data like this and you can say, wow, okay, so if we can do things that would enhance the structural complexity of riparian forests along streams and rivers, that might have a beneficial impact on the condition of those rivers. And we also know that structural complexity itself is correlated directly with carbon storage, as I showed you in that previous graph. There are other stream benefits that might accrue from developing high carbon, high biomass forests along streams and rivers. So for instance, in these graphs, you're seeing a relationship between the woody debris volumes and densities in stream channels as a function of forest age. These are data from the Adirondack Mountains and the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Very strong relationship between forest age and woody debris recruitment into streams. And we know that woody debris in streams is important in a lot of different ways. It's important because it provides fish habitats like pools and bat channels. It enhances the roughness along stream banks, and roughness is something that we use to measure resistance to floodwaters because roughness absorbs flood energy. We know that woody debris traps sediments. So woody debris has a very important function in these stream channels. And again, if we can do things that encourage the development of high biomass forests that will recruit a lot of wood into stream channels, that would have a number of beneficial effects for those stream systems. Okay, so that's just a little bit on sort of the underlying science on the question of flood resilience and how there might be some relationship between that and biomass and carbon storage. What about the other co-benefit that we're interested in this talk? And that's this one, the idea that carbon financing might provide an additional incentive for conserving large unfragmented blocks of forest across the New England and northeastern landscape. Now this is something that a lot of people are interested in right now, and the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources through the Fish and Wildlife Department has put a lot of work into mapping out where these unfragmented forest blocks are. This is part of their conservation design program. And later in this talk, when I present the carbon feasibility study, I'll show you how we've used some of these data and looked at the correlation between forest blocks and the privately owned parcels that might have the greatest opportunity for forest carbon project enrollment. So this is going to come into play a little bit later. Now, why would we be so concerned about conserving large unfragmented forest blocks? Well, because there's some disturbing trends out there on the landscape. These are data that were compiled by Harvard Forest and published recently in a series of reports called Wildlands and Woodlands, A Vision for the New England Landscape. And what you're seeing here are the long-term trends in the 6 New England states. Now, much of this story is one that most people are familiar with. Almost everybody knows the history of clearing in the 19th century, as the landscape was cleared mostly for agricultural uses. Most people also know about the incredible recovery of forest cover that we've seen in the northeastern U.S. over the last 150 years, the amazing resilience that our ecosystem has shown to this particular land use history. But what most people are not aware of is the more recent trends. The fact that forest cover is now declining in all 6 New England states for the first time in 150 years. So this is disturbing to many, and it suggests that, okay, maybe there's something that we need to do about that. Maybe we need to start thinking about trying to arrest this decline, and we need to think about doing everything we possibly can to conserve working forests and to keep forests in business and to conserve open space. Okay, so the most recent set of recommendations and data were published in this report here. It's called Wildlands and Woodlands, Farmlands and Communities. It's basically an update to our earlier report. This, by the way, is a very interesting consensus vision presented by 31 scientists from throughout the Northeast, again led by the group at Harvard Forest. I was fortunate to participate in this. And in this report and in this study, we've determined that the major cause of these more recent declines in forest cover really has nothing to do with forest management or agriculture, so it's not similar in any way to the previous history. Rather, it is purely a function of exurban and rural sprawl. So this particular development pattern of scattered incremental housing and commercial development that gradually fragments the forest and reduces its functionality from an ecological standpoint. So this is what we're talking about addressing, and in this talk we want to think about how carbon financing again could provide an incentive for working forests to stay in business, basically an incentive for conserving unfragmented forests and open space. Okay, so this is an ambitious vision that we have. We have argued that we should have a target of at least 70% of the region's forests permanently conserved or maintained in some status, either as working forests that would comprise the majority of the landscape, or maybe also in some wildland preserves representing a minority of the landscape. So at least 70% permanent maintenance of forests in our landscape. But to achieve that objective by the year 2060 would necessitate basically tripling the pace of conservation. So it's an ambitious agenda, but it gives us something to shoot for. Now in Wildlands and Woodlands, again, we tried to compile all of the things that we could possibly think of that would help us get to that objective. So triple the pace of conservation, achieve that 70% goal. And one of those was the idea that carbon markets and carbon financing might provide a financial incentive, again, that could be layered on top of other revenue streams. So timber, recreation, tax abatement programs, cost share programs, conservation easements, non-timber forest products, everything that savvy landowners are doing to stay in business. And then carbon financing could provide an additional layer of revenue that might help them stay in business. Okay, so that brings us to the carbon market context that we need to understand to make this work. And it's important to understand that there are basically 2 different types of carbon markets out there that landowners could take advantage of. The first is called the voluntary market. Some people also call it over-the-counter. And this is basically an international market seller in which a carbon project developer, typically a forest landowner somewhere in the world, generates greenhouse gas emissions offsets that are then sold, sometimes through a broker or an intermediary, directly to an end buyer, basically an emitter somewhere in the world that for whatever reason is interested in offsetting a portion of their emissions. Now there are lots of different types of buyers. Sometimes these are corporations that have a commitment to reducing their emissions or their carbon footprints. Sometimes these are governmental agencies, sometimes even at the scale of entire countries, like for example Norway is a major buyer of emissions offsets. So buyers tend to vary, but this is how the voluntary market system works. The compliance market is a little bit different. These are also called cap and trade. the most successful cap and trade market that we have currently in North America is the California market that has a number of different names. Some people call it ARB or AB 32, which was the legislation in California that created the market. It's also most commonly referred to as CARB, which stands for California Air Resources Board. It's just the agency in California that manages this market system. So this is a cap and trade market. A place is capped on the, a cap is placed on the overall emissions from the regulated sectors in California that represent something like 85% of California's total emissions. And then over time, this cap is slowly ratcheted down. It decreases 3% every year. And the idea initially was that California, in doing this, would reduce its emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020. Most recently, actually, because the program was so successful, this has been working so well out there, California decided that after 2020, they're actually going to reduce that target even further, and they're hoping to achieve 40% reduction below 1990 levels in the future. Okay, so this is how cap and trade works, and lest you think that this gives the emitters there kind of like a get out of jail free pass or something, that's really not true. So 92% of their emissions have to be met, emissions reductions have to be met at the smokestack, so to speak, at the point of emissions. So 92% have to be real emissions reductions. 8% can be offsets that are purchased on the market system. That's where forestry comes into play, because the forest sector is one of the sectors that can generate those offsets and can sell them into the California system to help achieve that 8% of emissions reductions. Back to the global voluntary market. Just wanted to quickly make the point that this is truly a global system in that forest carbon projects anywhere in the world can generate these offsets and can sell them to a willing buyer anywhere else in the world. So we can be right here in little old Vermont, but we can be selling offsets literally to anyone anywhere in the world. So we have to think big, we have to think globally. And these are the most recent data published just this fall that show the extent to which really the voluntary market has grown over the last decade or so. The market's doing quite well. Even though the total volume of transactions has actually come down in the last couple of years, the price point on the voluntary market has now come up almost to an equivalent level as the California compliance market. The California market is trading emissions offsets at about $15 per metric ton of CO2 equivalents, which is a very attractive price for forest landowners. The voluntary market is at about $11 or $12 per ton of CO2 equivalent, but that's still very attractive in many cases. This map just shows you the countries in which forest carbon offsets are being generated, and you can see that really a large number of basically forested countries in the world, for lack of a better way to describe it, are participating in the voluntary market, and this includes both boreal countries, temperate zone countries, as well as tropical zone countries. So really a large share of the world's forested countries are now participating in the global voluntary market. Back to the compliance market. I want to make this point that forest carbon projects are happening now. This is no longer a hypothetical question, it's reality. The California market started in 2014. It's providing really a tremendous opportunity for forestry projects, both what we refer to as U.S. forest projects, meaning forestry projects anywhere in the country, as well as urban forestry, especially urban tree planting. And then even more recently, the California market has been synchronized with other compliance markets in North America. For instance, the market up in Quebec, which just went in line 2 years ago and is now growing quite rapidly, as well as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is our regional carbon market here in the Northeast. Now, even though there is this synchrony now between these markets, which basically means that Quebec and RGGI have adopted the California protocol for forest carbon projects, even though we have that synchrony, we haven't seen any forest carbon projects registered on RGGI. Now, there are a whole variety of reasons why that's the case. The price point is very low for emissions offsets under RGGI, and this system, it just really hasn't gotten going here under the RGGI system, but it might in the future. But for now, on the compliance market, almost all the action is through CARB, is through the California system. So landowners here in the Northeast that are interested in this particular market system are generally selling into the California market, not RGGI. And then again, we might see this change in the future. There might even be the opportunity to sell into the Quebec market. We'll have to see where that goes. Currently, that's not an opportunity. Okay, and then finally, on the market system context, taking a look at this map, you see that we have forest carbon projects now either developed or underdeveloped or development all over the country, including a handful here in the Northeast. Although interestingly, until very recently, we hadn't had a single project in Vermont. We now do have one at Middlebury College, and that's why I and others have been really interested in this question of, what can we really do to get carbon projects going in Vermont? Let's not wait any longer. Let's see what we can do to get those going. Okay, so if one was interested in participating in these market systems, either the voluntary or the compliance markets, what would be the options available? Well, there's three basic mechanisms for participation. The first is called reforestation, afforestation, basically planting forests, either where there used to be forests or where there haven't been forests previously. The second is called avoided land use conversion, meaning you are conserving a parcel and preventing it from being converted into a non-forest use. And then the third is called improved forest management. Now, this is the mechanism that has seen the greatest amount of activity because this is the one that typically applies most readily to managed forests, to industrial forests, to small non-industrial forests, working forests of all sorts. But under an improved forest management approach, the key that one needs to understand is this thing called additionality. Now, additionality means you are going to make some change in the way you manage that forest. You're going to manage it differently so that you add some margin of carbon storage over time as compared to a baseline. Now, these baselines vary, and this gets very complicated very quickly, but an example of a baseline is the regional norm or average amount of carbon that's stored out there on your landscape. And additionality is often calculated as the difference between the carbon stocking on your property and the carbon stocking on the landscape as a whole. Now, that's the case for the California compliance market. The baselines for the voluntary markets are a little bit different. But anyway, this idea of additionality is the key to making improved forest management work. So some students in my lab and I took a look at the kinds of silviculture or forest management practices that we might be able to use in the Northeast to achieve additionality in an improved forest management project. And I thought I would show you the results of this study to give you some idea of what we're talking about, to try to address this question of what kind of forest management would really work for additionality. We selected 32 stands from across northern New England and northern New York. These were from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Network maintained by the U.S. Forest Service. We ran those data through a successional simulator called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, and we imposed on the stands 9 different management scenarios, 8 active management scenarios and 1 no management scenarios. And these scenarios basically range from more intensive cutting on shorter rotations to less intensive cutting on longer rotations or longer entry cycles. So we're getting the full continuum of forest management intensities and frequencies. And now I can show you the model projections that came out of this study. So what I'm going to show you is the total carbon storage under each of those management scenarios over 160 years, which is basically sort of 2 rotations for a sugar maple forest on average, if you were using even-age silviculture. And then the y-axis here is the total amount of carbon that's stored in the forest, as well as the carbon that's transferred into the wood product stream over time, because that's very important. We've got to account for the amount of carbon that's going into wood products as well. And it also needs to account for the life cycle of the carbon as it moves through that wood product stream. So all of that's going to be captured by this y-axis here. Okay, so the first scenario here is the no management scenario, the carbon that builds up over time in the unmanaged forest. And then we'll jump to the other end of the spectrum, which is the more intensive management scenario. So clear cutting on high frequencies or short rotations, and then we'll just start working our way up through these other management scenarios. And what's happening here is that management intensity is decreasing and management frequency is also decreasing. And what you're hopefully seeing is that, oops, we'll go back, is that the average amount of carbon stored over time, both in the forest and in wood products, is gradually increasing as we decrease management intensity a little bit. Now we can look at that another way on this graph. So same y-axis basically, and we have the range of management scenarios here ranging from high intensity management to lower intensity management. And we're seeing the amount of carbon that's stored over that 160-year period, both in the forest as well as wood products. And the really important take-home from this graph is not that one needs to stop managing forests in order to do improved forest management. That is not the message here. The message is that to achieve additionality under existing improved forest management protocol, one needs to make some change to the management, a subtle change that adds this margin of enhanced carbon storage as we move from one management approach to another management approach. Now those changes might include things like a little bit more retention, slightly longer rotation periods, or just simply doing a really careful job of maintaining carbon stocking across a property as a whole. So these are the kind of subtle tweaks in management that forest landowners are looking at in order to participate in carbon markets. Now, one question that often comes up is this question of substitution effects. This has gotten a lot of attention in the press recently. Substitution effects are the idea that if we use more wood, particularly for durable wood products, so things like timber frame structures built from cross-laminated lumber or composite materials, that we could enhance the strength of the wood products sink as well. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a very active area of investigation, and it holds a lot of potential, you know, to think about things that we can do to enhance that wood products sink as well. Currently, though, I have to say that there is a fair degree of scientific uncertainty around this question, like exactly how markets would respond to increased wood production, whether we can reliably say that if you manage a forest more intensively, you would achieve more carbon storage in wood products through this kind of building, for example. And because of this uncertainty, the carbon markets don't currently allow you to account for substitution effects, meaning the emissions that you have avoided by using wood in place of something else like concrete or steel or plastics. But the carbon markets do allow you to account for the carbon stored directly in wood products themselves. So if we enhance that wood products pool, that's certainly going to benefit the additionality that you could achieve under carbon market protocol. This is a very complicated topic, and I'd be happy to take questions on it. Okay, so into the next part of the talk. So that was a little bit on the carbon silviculture, the carbon forestry, how do we actually do improved forest management. Now we need to take a look at whether any of this would really be financially viable in the Northeast. So to understand that point, or to answer that question, we need to look at a bunch of different things. So first of all, the market price points. So how would viability vary as a function of the price that the markets are offering for these emission offsets? Transaction costs. The cost of developing a project and enrolling in a market are high. There's a tremendously high burden in terms of the inventory data. They have to be just so. They have to be done very precisely. They have to have a very low error. Those inventory data need to be validated by a third-party validator. There are legal costs. There are the transaction costs associated with setting aside a certain amount of the revenue into a long-term monitoring fund. So these transaction costs are actually quite high. And so we need to look at those and whether the revenue would actually be greater than those transaction costs. Policy assumptions, this basically means how might these markets change in the future. Economies of scale, as property sizes increase, would we gain economies of scale in that since many of these transaction costs are fixed costs, the sort of benefit to cost ratio would increase as property size increases, so that's something we need to look at. What about carbon stocking? How does that affect financial viability? And then other site characteristics like productivity and forest types and growth rates and those kinds of things. Okay, so we took a look at those factors, those determinants of financial viability in this study, which used inventory data from 25 properties distributed throughout northern New England and a few over in New York. Those inventory data were fed through the forest vegetation simulator, as in the previous study that I presented. And we played around with different management scenarios just like before, different combinations of silvicultural systems in order to model the amount of carbon stored over time in wood products and in the forests, so just as before. But something different in this study is that we then also looked at the transaction cost side of the equation. So we compiled all of these data on all of the different transaction costs that would go into developing a project like this. And so you're seeing here in this table that those costs are formidable, and there are many of them. And so if we put all of that together, the carbon accrual as a function of the forest management, as well as those transaction costs, we get a picture here of the sort of net cash flow over time, for lack of a better way to describe this. Now, don't worry about any of this stuff over here in the legend or what these lines really are. I just want you to see that cash flow, just measured in straight, US dollars, straight greenbacks, varies tremendously from one scenario to another. So we've got some scenarios that are making money, they're generating revenue over time. Other scenarios that immediately go into the red and never recover. Okay, so we've got to figure out what's driving this. Why are some scenarios money winners and others are money losers? Excuse me. Well, one very important determinant is the carbon stocking that a property has initially, so at time zero, relative to a baseline. Now, on the California market, that baseline is called common practice, which basically represents the average regional carbon stocking for your ecoregion and for sites of similar productivity. So where a property starts off relative to this regional average has a huge effect on financial viability. These are some management scenarios that I worked on in another paper in which we were wondering whether we could use carbon financing to incentivize rehabilitation on high-graded former industrial timberlands. So this was a property in northeastern Vermont that had been severely high graded in the past. It had very poor stocking, very poor quality, and we played around with all of these different rehabilitation scenarios. And what you're seeing here is that all of them started out well below the regional average for carbon stocking. And because of that, even though they were generating revenue from carbon additions over this time period, they all lost money. Now, the reason is because they started off below common practice, that regional average, as compared to a scenario like this, a property that's well stocked and starts off above that regional average, that generates a big pulse of credits right off the bat for the difference between their initial stocking and that regional average. Those initial credits cover your transaction costs. So you've covered your costs, you've set aside funds into a monitoring fund, and then thereafter you're actually generating additional revenue. So that's why this kind of scenario that starts with good stocking tends to be more financially viable under existing markets. So let's look at it this way. We've put together this decision tree that helps a landowner figure out when they're going to be financially viable. So if we go this way, a property that's well stocked, maybe 40% above that regional average, depending on how these markets change in the future, is going to have a high rate of return. This is mean internal rate of return. Internal rate of return. So this is a metric that investors often use to measure their return on investment. So that's going to be financially valuable if you go that way. Let's say you're poorly stocked, or maybe not as high above that regional average, but you still have a large property, so you're gaining economies of scale. You might still achieve a high internal rate of return down here. So this decision tree is showing you that you can have a variety of variables, there are a variety of pathways that will get you to financial viability, a high rate of return on investment. We can look at it this way as well. We put together a variety of different spreadsheet tools like this one that help you understand when a carbon project is going to be viable and when it won't be. And so here again you see this issue of economy of scale, that it's really only the larger parcels that are generating the larger net present values over the first 20 years, as well as the higher rates of return. So this is showing you that also another critical factor is who is financing the project. Is the landowner putting up the financing for all those transaction costs, or is an outside project developer coming in and putting up the capital to cover all of those transaction costs in exchange for a percentage of the offset credits that are generated? And again, the financial viability, like is it viable, yes or no, depending on how the project is financed. But generally you're seeing that as property size increases, the financial viability increases as well. And we've been able to put a number on this threshold right here of about 1,100 acres in the Northeast. That you have, if you have a property that's about 1,100 acres or greater in size, there's a better chance that you might be financially viable. Okay, so that then is the final segue into the Vermont Forest Carbon Feasibility Study. This is the most recent thing that we've worked on, and we've picked up on that idea of economies of scale and the idea that it's really just the medium to larger sized properties in the Northeast that will have the greatest potential for carbon project development. Now, yes, it could be single large properties that are, I don't know, 1,000 or 1,500 acres in size or more, or a project might be financially viable if several somewhat smaller properties, let's say on the 200 or 300 or 500 acre scale, were aggregated together. Aggregation is not something I've talked about yet, but that's an option that's available under the voluntary market systems, that multiple landowners can pool their resources, so to speak, and can go in together under an aggregated project. And by doing so, they achieve these economies of scale that collectively get them up above this sort of minimum acreage that you need to make a project financially viable. Okay, so in the Vermont Forest Carbon Feasibility Study, we wanted to identify where those parcels are in Vermont. And then, furthermore, look at where those properties would overlap with other co-benefits that we're really interested in. So now finally we come full circle to these issues of flood resilience and core habitat block protection. We then want to identify landowners that might be actually interested in participating in carbon projects and get some demonstration projects off the ground. Okay, so let me show you what we've done. This, by the way, is work that was conducted for us or in collaboration with us by Bill Van Doren and Charles Kirshner and others at a consulting firm called Spatial Informatics Group. And this is a project that was funded by the High Meadows Fund and done in collaboration with Vermont Land Trust and Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I just want to make sure I acknowledge our partners. So we started with a parcel map like this. Actually, let me go back. Like this, that basically shows us where those larger size parcels are in Vermont. We then took those and we applied a rating system that was developed at the Gund Institute by Doctors Carrie Watson and Taylor Ricketts that basically break down the Vermont landscape into its utility for flood resilience. Now, they used a complex system for rating flood resiliency on the landscape that accounts for things like forest cover and infrastructure, road density, housing, a whole variety of different metrics. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail today, but suffice it to say we used this flood resiliency layer that the Gund Institute had developed. And then we also looked at those forest blocks that the Vermont State Agency of Natural Resources had mapped. And we put it all together like this. Okay, so we start off with the larger properties, the parcels that are greater than 500 acres in size, and we want those that have at least 450 acres of forest on them. We rated those in terms of, I'm not sure actually what this one is here, but basically rating parcels based on the amount of forest that they have, rating them in terms of their flood resilience score, rating them in terms of their overlap with the core forest blocks, either inside those blocks or within a quarter mile of those blocks, thinking of properties that might buffer forest blocks or even enhance those forest blocks. And through this composite rating scale, combining large properties with flood resilience and core habitat coincidence, we then come up with these acreages that are in each side of those, inside each of those tiers. And we come up with this number here that we have about 484,000 acres of forest land in Vermont that would be highest priority, both for carbon, because they're large and well stocked, but also for flood resilience and core habitat protection. Now, one question that came, we can look at the parcel size distribution here of that 284,000 acres. And you're seeing that, it's a negative exponential distribution. The majority of those parcels are in this 500 to 1,000 acre range, and then there are a few larger ones out here. Now, another question that has come up along the way is, well, okay, that's all well and good, but if we want to use carbon funding to conserve additional forest land that's not already protected, let's say under a conservation easement or through ownership by a group like the Nature Conservancy or a land trust, let's filter out the properties that are not currently protected or under easement, and that's what you're seeing here in this graph. So when we filter out the properties that are not yet conserved, We have a somewhat lower number, about 139,000 acres, but that's still a fairly robust acreage that that achieves this top priority rating, both in terms of carbon feasibility as well as the possibility of achieving other co-benefits. And here's the parcel size distribution for that. Again, the majority of the parcels in this 500 to 1,000 acre range, and then a few larger parcels out here. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'll just wrap up here quickly. To demonstrate that a project on some of those parcels would be financially viable, we've used a case study approach, and we've used parcel data from an initiative called Cold Hollow to Canada, and you're seeing a shot from their website here. Cold Hollow to Canada is an initiative on, I think, 7 townships in northern Vermont, working with landowners in that region. You're seeing it here as this corridor linking northern Vermont with southern Quebec. It's an initiative that is helping landowners do good forest stewardship, forest planning on their properties, and also helping them access other revenue streams that, again, will help them conserve their working forest landscape. So we used parcel data from, inventory data from 7 of the Cold Hollow to Canada properties, and these are all properties that I think were roughly 300 acres or more in size. And we modeled those as a hypothetical aggregated project, again, combining multiple kind of medium-sized properties under voluntary market protocol. So we fed those data through the simulation models, we applied the market protocol, we accounted for all the transaction costs, and then we came up with the estimate of net revenue that would be generated by a project like this in the first 10 years for a real collection of properties in the Cold Hollow to Canada area. And we came up with this number right here. $943,000 of net revenue that would go to the landowners after the first 10 years, or over the first 10 years. And again, this is accounting for the revenue that would go to a project developer. So in our case, we assumed that an outside developer would come in, put up the capital to launch this project in return for 40% of the offset credits. But even accounting for that revenue to the developer, the landowners get almost $1 million in revenue over the first 10 years. Now that's not bad. If you work this out on a per acre basis, that's about $16 per acre per year in supplementary revenue that's layered on top of the existing revenue streams that they're capturing. Maple syrup, timber, tax reduction through current use enrollment, all of those other supplemental revenue streams. So this begins to look attractive to some landowners in that it's just adding that additional incentive to make working forests financially viable. So the last slide is this rather complicated one, and this will be available publicly soon in our report. But basically, we've tried to sketch out this decision tree that will help a landowner understand the best pathway for forest carbon project development in Vermont. And it's a complicated endeavor because a landowner needs to put together a lot of different things. You need a management plan. There are a variety of different things that markets will accept for management plans. So current use, value appraisal, enrollment, or conservation easement, or even forest certification under any certification system. All of these things qualify a landowner for market participation. And then further down the road, there are other considerations that affect financial viability, such as opportunities for cost share, forest legacy funding, a whole variety of things that can be layered, again, to make carbon projects financially viable. In any case, we've tried to map out this pathway that combines all of these different stewardship and conservation mechanisms to really help make carbon projects financially viable. Okay, then final slide, because I'm really over time now. I just wanted to reiterate the take-home message, which is that carbon projects can work in the Northeast. There are a variety of tools and mechanisms now that are available. There's a lot of flexibility for landowners in terms of how to do this, but carbon projects will not work for everyone. It's not going to work everywhere. It's not going to work on small parcels or poorly stocked parcels. So that's just a reality that we have to accept. It will work on larger ownerships and those that are well stocked initially, those that have been well managed in the past. The current offset prices are robust and attractive. There are a variety of options under both voluntary and compliance market systems, but the key, as with any kind of forest management, is integration with the other landowner objectives. So it's not going to work for everyone, but it's going to work where a landowner is interested in these types of co-benefits and these types of really high-quality forest stewardship practices. The key is layering with other revenue streams, and if we can do all of this, there's the potential to yield both financial, climate, flood resilience, and conservation benefits. And with that, I will thank you again for attending. I want to acknowledge the funders, High Meadows Fund, NSRC, McIntyre Stennis, and NRCS. And I would be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing all that information. So, folks, just a quick reminder, to submit a question, go to your GoToWebinar side panel, click on the Questions tab, and you can go ahead and type in your question there. While you're typing in your questions, I just wanted to share a few reminders. At the end of the webinar today, you will receive a link to the survey. Please go ahead and fill that survey out. Again, that's where you can submit your continuing education credits and also give us feedback on the webinar today, as well as ideas for future webinars. I will just let folks know that you will get a follow-up email as well with a link to the survey, so if you can't complete it after the webinar this morning, you can complete it another time. Please only complete it once, though. And let's see here, just a reminder, so the next webinar will be on January 9th, and we'll be hearing from Paul Cataranzo with UMass Extension on forestry legacy planning. So you'll receive an email reminder about that, but look forward to having you join us then. So it looks like we do have a few questions coming in, Bill, so I think we can get a few of these in before the hour is up. The first question is from Harris. If you forgo managing sugar maple stands for timber and instead manage it as a sugar bush with minimal harvesting, is that considered additionality?
Oh boy, that's actually a really great question. I'm going to tell you that I don't know for sure what the answer is to that. That's a question that a number of people have posed recently, wondering whether sugar bushes would be eligible for a carbon market enrollment. My impression is that they would be, that there's nothing that would inhibit or prohibit that, but that hasn't really been tried a whole lot. Now, someone might be able to tell me of an example that I'm not aware of, but I personally don't know of any good examples of sugar bushes that have been enrolled. I don't see anything directly in the market protocol that would prevent that, but it's a little bit of an unknown territory. So I'm going to have to just leave it at that for now. I think that is something that might work in the future. It hasn't really been tried much so far.
Great, thanks, Bill. A question from Walter about getting a copy of the presentation. Bill, would you be willing to provide a copy of the presentation that I can share out to participants, or at least some additional links to where people can go for more information?
I would be. I'd be glad to. The last bit on the Vermont Carbon Feasibility Study, though, is something that we haven't released publicly yet in hard copy form. We're planning to over the next month or so. As soon as that is released, then I'm happy to share the full presentation.
Perfect. Yeah, if you just want to go ahead and email it to me, or just let me know when that study has been released. I'm happy to share that with folks who have joined the webinar today.
Okay.
And then, if you don't mind, maybe just another quick question here. I actually see a few more questions that have come in. Peter has a question about kind of, I guess it's sort of where to get started, where do foresters find information so that they know where to begin with landowner clients. Any recommendations or thoughts on that, Bill?
Yes, so there are a huge number of resources available online, of course. A good one, if you want to just start educating yourself about the basics of this stuff, how it all works, is a website called Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace. If you Google that, Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace, it goes through everything. And there's a report that they have online, updated every year, called The State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets. And that report walks you through absolutely everything. So that's a good starting point. But then if you want to, take the next step and you're interested in talking with someone about how to actually develop a carbon project on your property or in your neighborhood, then I would suggest contacting one of the consulting firms that really has expertise in this area. Now the reality is, currently that expertise really is in this particular kind of market sector of the firms that have really invested in the tools and the simulation techniques and the inventory methods and the other things to develop projects like this. I don't want to be biased here in terms of recommending one company over another. I'll just toss out a couple of names. There's the company that I work with a little bit called Spatial Informatics Group. There are others though. There's Finite Carbon, there's Blue Source, there's New Forests. There are a whole variety of companies like this that you could approach, and sometimes they're actually willing to do sort of an initial assessment for you of project viability for free. And they'll also help walk you through the basics. So that would be a good place to start.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. And we do have two other quick questions here, and folks, I understand if we are at 10:30, just a little past 10:30, so if you need to sign off, I understand. But we have a question from Lawson about your thoughts, Bill, on minimum time commitments for projects and how that plays into the feasibility or attractiveness for landowners to enroll.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's often kind of a make or break factor for a lot of landowners. So, for example, I know landowners that have looked at the California market and they determined that they would have a high amount of revenue under the California system, but they didn't like the 100-year time commitment or contract period for that market system. That was just too onerous for them for whatever reason. On the other hand, they found the 40-year contract period under the voluntary market system much less burdensome and much more attractive. So I'm not saying that one market system is better than the other. They both have pros and cons, but that difference, 100 years versus 40 years, is an important factor for a lot of people. Certainly one you would want to consider.
Great, thanks, Bill. And one last quick question, which I think is helpful for folks looking to get started. How can we determine the baseline in our area and thus the value of our forests for carbon sequestration?
Okay, so a seemingly simple question, but it's actually very complicated because it depends on which baseline we're looking at. And actually, the different market systems use different kinds of baselines. So I can't give you a very simple answer to that. But again, someone with expertise in this area, like one of those consulting firms I mentioned, would be able to help you determine that very quickly. If you want to take a crack at it yourself, this all-important number called common practice, which is the regional average carbon storage, is available online. If you go to the California Air Resources Board website and you Google compliance carbon market, and then you're going to have to click on a couple buttons, like forest sector, forest offsets, blah, blah, blah. Eventually you'll get into the actual protocol for that market. And it's going to refer you to a big appendix that's available online with lots and lots of tables. And you're going to have to kind of weed through that appendix, and you're going to have to find your ecoregion. So where are you? and you have to know whether your forest is highly productive or less productive. And using all these things I just described, you're going to find a cell in that table that has that number, that baseline that you would have to compare your stocking against. So you see right there from that example that this is fairly complicated, but for someone who's really motivated, you can find it yourself. Now under the voluntary market, the baseline is a little bit different. It's really just sort of the norm of forestry in your area. So if you have a sense of kind of the condition of forest parcels in your area and sort of what other people are doing and how your forest is doing relative to those, you would have a pretty decent sense of whether you are above that baseline or below it. I hope that makes sense.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. We do have one more question from Peter, but Peter, I think what I'm going to do is put you in touch directly with Bill as a follow-up, because it looks like it's a pretty complicated one. So Bill, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to join us and sharing all this great research. As you can tell from all the questions, there's lots of interest in this topic, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. And folks, just a quick reminder again, our next webinar is scheduled for January 9th, and we'll be talking about forestry legacy planning for professionals. So how to talk to landowners about planning and conserving their forests for the future. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us this morning. Thank you again to Bill for a great presentation, and look forward to seeing you all online in January. Have a good morning. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.